Record losses of Russian artillery. The Ukrainian armed forces are performing miracles on the front. What will the Russian offensive be like, and when might it begin on a larger scale? Trump is imposing tariffs practically against the entire world. How will Europe react, and how will Asian countries respond? Why didn't Russia end up on the sanctioned tariff list? Welcome, friends, to my channel. I am Alexander Musienko, and this is a traditional briefing for you on the events that I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. I will start with some very good and pleasant news. The fact is that the American publication Forbes, with David Axe, an observer who, let's say, very meticulously follows what is happening on the front of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and provides the relevant information. So, Forbes reports that on one day, March 28th, the Defense and Security Forces of Ukraine destroyed a huge amount of Russian artillery. This is a record for a single day. It has never happened before. So now you will hear these numbers. Only on the March 28th, it was destroyed 122 units of various types of Russian artillery. Imagine that, 122 in one day on March 28th. Well, we have something to be proud of. It's a record, and I think it's a world record. This is not just a record for the armed forces of Ukraine, the defense and security forces. Everyone who is now heroically and selflessly defending our state, this is truly a record we should be proud of. Therefore, I urge you, here in the comments, to also thank the defense forces of Ukraine, those who destroy the enemy daily, thwart their plans, and are the best and most effective guarantee of security. For us, for the entire Ukrainian nation and our people, this is important. In total, during March, 1644 artillery units were destroyed, which is approximately 3 times more compared to 2023. The publication reports, referring not only to cannons but also to mortars used by the enemy. And for comparison, here are the numbers just for understanding how significant this is. The United States has about 3,000 artillery systems in total, and the United Kingdom has only 200. Although, obviously, these figures do not account for what is in storage. This is the scale of how the Ukrainian defense forces actually operate. Forbes reports that Russia is actively depleting its stockpiles of Soviet-era weapons to make up for losses. Additionally, Russia is purchasing guns, Koksanti from North Korea. Well, these are the losses. And regardless of how it is, this leads to the fact that by the end of 2025, Russia can no longer expect to conduct offensive operations, at least not on the larger scale they refer to. Because further on, time will be needed for the supply of additional ones from North Korea, as well as the production of both artillery shells and barrels, and also directly the shells for them, which requires time, resources, and expenses. That's why when we talk about a possible Russian offensive, well, when you ask me a lot in the comments about how this Russian offensive will look, where it will be, indeed, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, reported that we are observing an increase in activity. The enemy, that Russia, may be preparing a 200,000-strong military contingent and preparing offensive actions from 3 directions. These are the Sumy region, Kharkiv region, and the Zaporizhia direction. However, these forces will be effectively dispersed along the front line. Accordingly, they will be carrying out tasks. What is the goal? The enemy's goal, well, of course, is to advance and occupy as much Ukrainian territory as possible. The second goal, of course, if they succeed, is to try to break through our defense line, outflank or get behind the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian group in those defense sectors where the enemy will be advancing, and in this way, effectively exert constant pressure. But the main goal, as it seems to me, considering that the Russian potential is decreasing specifically in equipment, artillery, and mortars, is that they are still relying on assaults by small tactical groups, on these so-called local assaults. In fact, the goal will be simply to exert maximum fire impact. That is, pressure on the positions of Ukrainian forces with the significant use of drones. Russia is working on increasing these components. And our task now for Ukraine, and what is said by our command, which is especially emphasized by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Oleksandr Syrsky, is to preserve the lives and health of the soldiers, which is extremely important. And already following the results of the March meeting, the Commander-in-Chief emphasized that measures have been taken to truly talk about even greater capabilities to protect our soldiers. This is very important. So, the goal is to counter drones by increasing not only our quantitative indicators for drones that we can use for deep strikes, attacks deep into Russia on its military targets, but also drones that can be used on occupied territories along the line of combat engagement to stop them. This is to inflict maximum damage on the advancing Russian troops. The enemy will primarily focus on exhausting the units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. The goal, besides what I mentioned, will be to try to break through and occupy an additional part of the territory. The aim here will also be to try to exhaust our forces units. This is what the enemy is counting on. But the units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces are preparing to resist. We really need to hold on. We need to be ready to strike the occupiers with everything we have. And this is what the Ukrainian Defense Forces will do, because the situation can change. It will change, and Russia will also become exhausted. Our task is to steadfastly endure and exhaust them before that happens. And what the enemy might do against us. Meanwhile, there are also good news coming. From the front, actually even from Russia. The fact is that a strategic missile carrier aircraft Tu-22M3 crashed in the Irkutsk region of Russia. The aircraft crashed on the night of April 2nd near the settlement of Burity in the Solsky district. The crew of 4 ejected as a result of the landing. 1 pilot died, according to the region's governor. In fact, the cause of the crash is cited as a technical malfunction. The Tu-22M3, Tu-95, and Tu-160 aircraft are not currently being produced in Russia. They have only been repaired and modernized. Therefore, this is, well, essentially a significant loss for Russia's strategic aviation. What does this indicate? This indicates that the intensive use of these aircraft, as Russia frequently employs them in the war against Ukraine, leads to such catastrophes. Plus, some of the equipment is outdated due to sanctions. Despite criticism of this sanctions regime and restrictions against the aggressor state, the lack of certain components, electronics, and equipment is still noticeable, which in fact leads to such actions. Plus the burden on the pilots. And this is far from the first disaster. I also want to remind you that the Ukrainian Defense Forces have repeatedly attacked airfields, particularly where Russian strategic aviation is based. And I hope they will continue to do so, striking Russia with everything we have. We need to increase our efforts. If the enemy terrorizes our cities, the enemy strikes Kharkiv again, like last night. Kryvyi Rih, a terrible tragedy. Ballistic strike in Sumy region, Kherson region, Zaporizhzhia direction, Donetsk region. My sincere condolences to the families and friends of the deceased, and a speedy recovery to those who were injured. We all support, hold on, and pray for all Ukrainians, for our civilians, and for our soldiers who defend our country. And I urge everyone to do what they can. Where is he himself? Therefore, we must strike. Our capabilities are growing, and the enemy must understand and realize this practically every day. And in the meantime, news from Britain. Britain will transfer Puma HC-2 helicopters to Ukraine. The United Kingdom will transfer military transport helicopters Puma to Ukraine, which were actually in service with the Royal Air Force of Britain. They plan to transfer from 8 to 10 helicopters, and in fact, this will enhance our capabilities. In fact, these are workhorses that have been involved in all British operations since 1971. Unfortunately, not new, but repaired, upgraded, and of course, this will add capabilities to our Army, aviation, and naval forces. in order to be able to transport military cargo in a rapid and efficient manner to where it is needed. This is very important, and efficiently. Meanwhile, what happened was essentially that the United States, seeing that the European Union and countries outside the European Union, such as Norway and Britain, are making decisions to invest more in the defense industrial complexes of these countries to increase the production of weapons, ammunition, and shells directly by European countries, and also hearing statements from French President Emmanuel Macron about the need to ramp up production and buy practically only European, the United States began to sound the alarm and saying, what about us? And don't forget that we are also one of the world leaders in arms production. And let's buy, including American. Remember, I warned about this and it was predictable. And what is the advantage of European decisions to increase spending on arms production, including, and very importantly, joint production with Ukraine? These are fundamentally important elements. So what is the importance? It is precisely this that pushed, it could not help but push, the United States, the American defense industry, to start hinting, I think, to President Trump's administration and their senators and congressmen about the fact that, stop, for whom are we increasing production, investing so much money, opening new enterprises, new productions, hiring people? Isn't this part of President Trump's program? Make America great again. After all, these are funds being invested in the USA. Well, finally, there is this awareness and understanding. And then they started saying, stop, we need to ensure and not forget that this weapon can be purchased from us and the USA. Here, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, while on a visit to Europe, he is currently on a European tour, emphasized that he urges buying specifically American weapons. Well, and this is good, because for Ukraine it provides opportunities and prospects to purchase what can be bought with European Union funds. Ammunition, shells, equipment, which will then be supplied to Ukraine. So this is a good signal. The main thing is that our European partners find the funds for this. We would really like them to be more active and effective and not as slow as the current decisions and bureaucratization. Meanwhile, Donald Trump stirred things up. Once again, he cannot do otherwise and unprecedentedly affects the planet. But for the first time in 100 years, sanctions have been imposed practically against all countries in the world, including non-sanctions. Oh, and I apologize, and for Ukraine, a 10% tariff on the import of all American Ukrainian goods, and so against everyone, even island nations, and even islands where only penguins live, and there are no people. Even so, well, and Russia did not end up on the list. How can this be explained? Let's see, let's listen to what explanations will be given. In general, tariffs of 35% have been imposed against Russia on the import of all sanctioned products. President Biden did this back in June 2022. So for almost 3 years, the 35% tariffs have been in effect on Russian goods. But if the Trump administration says it's 30 or 60, then why not raise it to at least 50, or better yet to 75%, or even 100% tariffs, effectively making any product that Russia can supply completely non-competitive? This is where the question arises, and so far there is no answer to it. But perhaps there are two options here. Either Trump and his team leave this issue aside in brackets in order to discuss it and keep it as a means of further pressure, still relying on the fact that perhaps Trump will manage to reason with Putin and the Russian dictator will eventually make concessions and talk about a ceasefire regime and about accelerating the negotiation process rather than blackmail, terror, and sabotage of everything that is happening, the American agreements with the Russians. Perhaps they are waiting to see how the direct negotiations with Dmitry, the representative of Russia, will end. And perhaps it is not very good for us. This scenario is being prepared to discuss joint mineral extraction in Russia, the USA, and the Russian Federation. It's hard to say right now. But in the coming days, we will see where this situation leads. Well, in the meantime, the publication Mer. Iranian sources reported that Iran is closing its airspace over the country, anticipating possible airstrikes from the USA. Iran is also preparing to retaliate and strike American bases located in the Middle East. So, the world is now on the brink of another major war that could ignite in the Middle East. By the way, what is Putin counting on? Why is he waiting? He is waiting to see what will happen in the Middle East, Greenland, or something else that might divert attention away from the Russia-Ukraine war and the fact that he is not fulfilling his agreements with the USA. Meanwhile, shorter news from Syria, because I still think that Russia and Putin will eventually be pushed out and expelled from there. Why? Because Turkey is ready to deploy its air defense systems to cover the Syrian capital Damascus and Syria, which of course may again cause friction with Israel, leading to complicated relations and so on. But then the question arises, what are the Russian bases there for? They become unnecessary there. Plus, Syria demands the extradition of the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, which Putin does not want to do. Therefore, it is obvious that Russia will have to say goodbye to its bases in Syria. Take care and glory to Ukraine.